I'm Ben Walsh, and this is Let Me Bread. This week on Let Me Bread, we are making a fluffy white loaf, courtesy of Mangshi.com. So let's get started. This recipe is going to be a little different than our usual recipes because we're going to be making it all over the stove top. We're only going to use heat for a little bit of time, but we will still need the residual heat from the pot to keep our dough warm so that it rises appropriately. So let's get started. First, I'm going to take a whole stick of butter and put it in our bowl here. And we're just going to put this in until it melts. Save the wrapper, by the way. If you're making this in a loaf tin, the wrapper is a great way to grease your bowl, more or less without having to use any butter. All right, so we're going to heat this on medium heat. And we're just going to use a whisk just to move it around, make sure it melts. And that should take just a second. Now, remember, when you're melting butter for something like this, you don't want the butter boiling. You just want it melted. If you boil the butter, you're going to alter it chemically, and it's not necessarily going to do exactly what you want it to do. Also, don't worry about how hot you get your butter. I'm actually going to be testing mine with a thermometer, but for the most part, you don't need to do that because we're going to use cold milk right out of the fridge to balance the heat. Let's turn this up here a little bit just so we get a little bit more meltage. And if you can't see what I'm doing, that's okay. I'm going to show you at each point of the process where we are or what it's looking like. So as soon as this melts, I'll show the camera and you can see just how we're doing this. All right, so we're about halfway melted here. We're going to take another minute or two to do this. While you're doing this, if you want to, you might want to get your milk out of the fridge. Might be a good time to do that. It'll still stay cold for the moment or two that you're going to have it out. So while this is melting, I'm going to do that. But once again, you just want to make sure you're not boiling your butter. So do keep one eye on it and make sure that no matter what happens, the butter doesn't get to where it's bubbling and boiling. All right, so you heard my butter start to make a little bit of a sputtering sound. That means that it's too hot. So I just went and turned it down to low real quick. All right, and we are done. So your butter mixture should look a little bit like this. Still nice and yellow and no browning bits in it. All right, so we're going to remove this from the heat. And so, by the way, remove from the heat doesn't mean just turn the heat off. It also means move it to a burner where it wasn't heat before. Because the metal, if you're using coils or even if you have a gas stove, like I do, it's going to stay warm for a little bit. All right, so next we're going to add our milk and our sugar. So I have a cup and a half of milk here. Just pour this in. Get rid of that. And we're going to stir those till just combined, and then we're going to add our sugar. We have a quarter cup of sugar here. So if it's not combining, you can lean your dish in a little bit and just whisk a little till it's just combined. All right, so mine's combined now. We're going to add our sugar. This quarter cup of sugar, we're going to make sure we stir it in until it's dissolved, okay? So just sprinkle it on top. Put that to the side, and then just stir in. This is going to be the food for our yeast. So make sure you get it nice and mixed in and dissolved here. All right, so you can see now that everything's dissolved. There's no more sugar kind of sticking on the bottom. If you're concerned about the temperature, give it a little touch on the side. If it feels cool, just warm it up just a little tiny bit. Again, you don't want anything close to bubble. So I'm going to test mine. Let's see how warm we are here. All right, so we're sitting at about 77 degrees. So this is a little cool for yeast. So what we're gonna do, we're just gonna move it back to our heated burner just a little bit. We're gonna turn it on low, very, very low. And we're just gonna stir it for a minute or two until we have that heat we want. Remember, we're still looking for about 100 degrees. Typically between 100 and 110. Now, it won't need to be on the heat for very long, so if you're checking with the thermometer, just make sure you're doing that pretty regularly. Yeah, we're already in the 80s degrees here, so I'm going to keep this on the heat. But you should just be aware that you don't want it too hot. All right, and it should start to smell pretty good. It should start to smell a little sweet at this point, the milk and the butter and everything together. It should smell a little nice. Now, the recipe calls for a whole milk or skim milk. I think honestly you can use any type of milk. Today, because of what I have in the house, we're just using almond milk. Shouldn't affect anything. But if it does, I'll let you know. All right, we're getting up there, 85. So we're gonna turn this heat up a little tiny bit, see if we can't move this process a little faster. Again, just like for any liquid that we're gonna put yeast in, always, if you don't have a thermometer, use the pinky test. If you put your pinky in and it feels nice enough that you'd wanna take a bath in it, that's about the right temperature. You don't wanna go any hotter than that. And don't worry, when we add our other liquids to it, it's not going to affect it. One more thing I want to mention about this recipe is that it's not a regular white bread recipe. This is what's called an enriched white bread recipe. And the reason it's called enriched is because the ingredients aren't just the usual four: flour, salt, sugar, and water. This recipe obviously includes butter, it includes eggs, and that's what makes it an enriched dough. If you were using honey as your sweetener, that would be another way to enrich it. Some people enrich their doughs with buttermilk. We'll make a buttermilk white loaf at some point in the future. But for now, just know that this is a type of enriched white loaf. All right, your consistency shouldn't change. We are just going to take its temperature one more time, just see how we're doing here. All right, and we are at just under 100 degrees. So I'm going to take this off the heat. I think this is probably done. All right. So now we have it at about 100 degrees. We are going to add our yeast mixture. We're going to add our yeast, and you're just going to sprinkle this on top. Now I'm going to lightly fluff with a whisk, but just like we've done in past weeks, just lightly fluff with a fork. And lightly fluff, by the way, just means you just very lightly on the surface, just mix that yeast so that it all gets wet. Remember, your yeast, although it's alive, it's freeze dried, right? Sorry, it's dried out. So in order for it to come back to life, it needs a little bit of moisture. So we're just going to mix that around in here. All right. So we're going to set a timer for 5 minutes. And let our yeast bloom a little bit. So while our yeast is doing that, I do want to talk a little bit about what happened last week. So apologies about that. I'm working with the streaming services, so maybe most of you probably noticed I use an app called Melon or Melon app or whatever you want to call it in order to do these streams on YouTube and Facebook. And for some reason, it just didn't send my image or any of my audio or even the whiteboard to the video, unfortunately. So it didn't broadcast. So not only was it unreviewable, you actually couldn't watch it at the time. It just looked like our usual background, the let them eat bread background the entire time, which admittedly is very disappointing, but it is what it is. So I took that episode down. You'll see it's no longer on the channel. It's a shame. It did make a lovely white bread. We will do that white bread recipe again sometime to make up for that episode, so you can see how I made it. Maybe next time I'll just make it free form as opposed to making a loaf tin. But either way, I contacted support there, and they were pretty helpful, although they didn't really know what was going on. So we ran some tests a couple days after the show aired to see if we could, figure out what was going on. But unfortunately, we were not able to do that. When we ran the test, everything ran just fine, which is a little disappointing, honestly, because the hope really is that you can run the test and replicate the problem. But we weren't able to do that. So for now, we'll just kind of have to see if this episode goes through. Hopefully it does. Hopefully you all can see me and hear me now. And hopefully we can make these episodes, just as good as they were before. I don't really know what happened. I think adding an intro video probably messed with it a little bit, which we really shouldn't have done, but I'm very proud of the intro video, so I am still going to try and use it as much as possible. Hopefully we'll have an outro soon. If we can get all these problems resolved, then hopefully it'll look pretty good for us. But for now, we just kind of have to deal with it. Unfortunately, we weren't able to replicate the issue, as I said earlier, and we're just going to have to see what happens. So hopefully you can see this all now. I can see myself on my laptop. It looks like it's doing what it should be, but you never really know until you review it, because I'm doing this live and there's no one else here. So hopefully we can do that, but we'll have to see. So meanwhile, we have a couple minutes left on our yeast mixture. And it should be eating these sugars now, just to, and it should start producing some bubbles. Just keep an eye on that. And actually, you should be able to see, so if you swirl yours around, yeast is going to kind of be everywhere, but you can see the yeast kind of doing its thing. You'll see little bubbles popping around the outside where the yeast kind of pushing away as it creates carbon dioxide bubbles from eating the sugars. So that's a good sign. Our yeast is in fact alive. We'll see how much it blooms. I've never done a bread recipe in a pot like this before. Pot's still pretty cool, but our yeast is alive, it is active, so we'll just have to keep an eye on that. We've got a couple minutes left. I may let it go for another few minutes. Oh, one more thing about today's show. It's going to be a little weird. We are going to take a quick pause, probably like a 5-minute pause right in the middle of the show, when we start to move things back to when I need to take it out of this bowl and need it on a board. As you can see, my usual board is not here. So we are going to be taking a quick pause so I can move the camera. So I can move the camera and make sure that everything is facing the right way, so you can see me actually knead the dough. And it's a very, very short knead, but more or less you can see me shape the dough and divide the dough up, because we're when that's ready. Also, this recipe calls for 2 hours of rising. I'm not going to do 2 hours of political commentary today. I'm just going to do about an hour. Might stretch it to an hour and a half. But there's a really good chance that it just that it's done by then. I'm in a very warm space right now, so we'll just have to see how that goes. And if we need longer, we may take a second break, or more likely, I'll just tell you how to do the rest of it at home and demonstrate a little bit later and just show what I've done and kind of write instructions for what I've done. So we've got to see. So you can see now in the bowl a little bit here, I have this nice little island of yeast. You can see that it is active. I've got some nice bloomage here, so we're ready. What we're going to do now is we're going to add our eggs and our salt. So I've got 2 eggs here, 2 large eggs. Just put them in here. Now this is not going to cook them. They're just not, it's not enough to cook them. We're going to add our salt. We've got a teaspoon and a half of salt here. I'm using kosher salt, but as usual, table salt will work just fine. And we're just mixing this all together until it is ready. You want to make sure that your eggs are fully whisked in, so you don't have like little bits of egg in your bread. Not that it's bad or anything, but it won't really cook right, and then you'll have like a weird piece of yolk or egg white just kind of chilling in your bread. And although there's nothing wrong with that, doesn't mean the bread's not cooked, anything like that. It just isn't pleasant. So you just want to make sure that everything's all mixed together. All right, so your liquid mixture should look a little bit like this now, kind of a yellowy, a light yellow pasty mixture here. So now we've done that. We are going to add, that was a little loud, sorry about that. We're gonna add our flour. We've got 4 cups of flour here, and we're just gonna mix it all in. I'm gonna swap my whisk out for a wooden spoon. So let me just add this in here. Now you might need a little bit more flour for this, you might need a little less flour for this. I'm putting the 4 cups in right away, but you don't have to. All right, so we're gonna take our wooden spoon here, and we're gonna stir for as long as we can. I like to make a figure-8 shape when I stir. I find that this mimics a folding technique. And if you don't know what folding is, by the way, folding is when you take part of the mixture and you move it to another part of the mixture. So usually like with a forward or backward sweeping motion. So for example, folding is great for when you have like a mixture that has liquid on the bottom or solids on the bottom and they're just not mixing, and the liquids and the solids aren't mixing well. So taking your spoon underneath it and then folding it back on top in that kind of circular motion is really helpful for mixing liquids and solids together. So we're going to keep stirring this until kind of a rough dough forms, and then we're going to knead it with our hands. So if you are going to knead with your hands, one, they should be clean, so make sure you wash them. Mine are clean. I've washed them. I washed them after I did the eggs and before everything else. But if you handle eggs recently, please, 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 please wash your hands. Being sanitary is very important to this show. As you know, we wash your hands several times during the episode, and we'll probably do so during this episode. All right, but not right now. So, because my hands are clean. All right, so our dough is really starting to come together. You can see it's kind of one singular mass. It looks a little wet and shaggy. It's all right. If you're worried, add a little bit more flour. We're actually not going to add a little bit more flour just yet. What we are going to do is twofold. One, I'm going to lightly flour my work surface real quick, which is behind me. And two, I'm going to coat my hands in flour, and I'm going to start kneading this. Well, first of all, I'm going to take all the dough off of the spoon because we really don't want it there. And we're just going to start mixing around. And if we need little bits of flour after that, we can do that. Again, we want our ball to be mostly a very slightly tacky and nice and soft. So let's do that. So you can't see, but I'm lightly flouring my work surface. On the other side, you'll see it when I move the camera. And then I'm going to pour probably about a tablespoon of flour in my hands, about this much. And we're just going to do our hands in it. I'm going to use our flour hands to remove this. And if you need more flour for your hands, which you might, that's okay. Just take a little bit more flour. All right, so we clean our spoon off, hands covered in flour. Maybe not enough flour, that's all right. So now we're just going to take our hand, on one of our floured hands, we're just going to move it. We're just going to move it around. You want to get everything together, and you want to do a kneading motion. Now, the kneading motion here is going to be a little limited, obviously. So the best way to do this is just scoop underneath and fold it in on itself like that. Very similar to the slat method, but we're actually not doing the slat method here. So scoop around and down, scoop around and down. And you want to get as much of it off the bottom as possible, off the sides as possible. That'll allow it to come together in a nice shape. Now this dough is pretty wet, so if you want to add a little bit of flour to it to give it some more, firmness, you're welcome to do that. All right, we're going to keep doing this until it's nice and tacky and doesn't stick so much. So you can see it's still coming off my hands. I'm going to add a little bit of flour to it. Like with all things, if you're adding flour to your dish, to your dough here, a little bit at a time, a dab will do good, as they say. All right, and again, just scoop up as much as you can and fold it onto itself. Now, stuff's going to get stuck on the sides. To the extent possible, use your fingers to grab that, or use the dough, right? If the dough is really in a place where it can start to take stuff off the sides, definitely do that. All right. So this extra flour has been really helpful. You can see that my dough is a little drier than it was just a moment ago. Sorry for the noise. It's going to be a noisy episode, I'm afraid. Again, just as much as possible, pick it up, fold it up over itself. So the fact that it's not sticking to the bottom anymore is actually a really good sign that we're getting somewhere. Oh, it's still sticking a little bit. Sorry. All right, but you can see actually now it's not sticking to my hands as much, so we are making progress. Again, over and down, pull it on itself as much as possible, over and down. Separating, not so good, that's all right. Yeah, and this should take anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes. But this is going to be an active 5 to 10 minutes, so you don't have to worry about doing too much else with it. Just do your lift and fold here. All right, I'm going to add a little bit more flour to mine. Again, only add a little at a time. I know this looks like a lot, but it's not. Probably like 2 tablespoons. And then again, up and over, right? You're folding in. The purpose of adding extra flour is to help it get a better kind of drier consistency. And also so that it has the ability to kind of latch on to some of the other dough that's stuck around. Also, it'll make it so it doesn't stick to your hands as much, which obviously we want, because we want this to be one cohesive ball. And we want it to be tacky but not sticky. All right, so in total, I'll probably add just about a 1/4 cup of flour extra, and that's looking like it's all I'm going to need, because you can see now this is one mass of dough. There's still a little bit of dough in the bottom of my container that I'm going to try and work in. I suggest you do the same. You really don't want to waste any of this to the extent you can help that. But also just be conscious of the amount of working that you do. Because the more you work it, the stickier it's going to get. Because that's how dough works. So now if you have the space in your pot, and I'm using a pretty wide-ended pot, so you should be able to take your dough and actually do like a regular kneading motion of hold to the side and fold in. And you should be able to start to get some of this dough off the side and bottom of your pot. If you need to switch hands, feel free to do that. And remember, use your fingers to get as much dough off the sides as possible and work it into your dough. You can see I can pull it up. That's great. Just want to do that. And then fold it over. And actually, because you're working with a pot, you can move. You want to rotate it 90 degrees each time. It's going to be really easy to do that. Yeah, fold it over itself. So grab a little bit like this. You can shake it out if you have to. And pull it down. Rotate 90 degrees. Pull it down. Rotate 90 degrees. Now we're not going to do this on a floured work surface. It's actually going to ride in the pot. So we'll get to move a little bit beforehand. All right, it's getting to the point where I probably need two hands to work it, which is fine. Fold one side down, fold the other. So this dough is still really nice and soft. And I can still work it with one hand. It's just easier to work with two. So I just grab and fold and rotate. Grab, fold, and rotate. That is our mantra for the next few minutes. But you can see, so we're getting to tacky. We're very, very close. So if I put my hand on it like this, I can leave it on for as long as I want it. Let's take 30 seconds, over count 30. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. When I take it off, it's still, my hand comes right off. So this is where we want it. At this point, if you're curious about its internal temperature, you want to know, is it 80 degrees inside? Camera so you can see, we're at 80 degrees. So this is going to rise now in here. I'm going to set a timer for an hour, and then we're going to take a 5-minute break so I can kind of reposition myself and clear everything off so that we have a nice clean area to work our dough when it's ready, but also to do our commentary for the week. So with that said, I'll see you in 5 minutes. We'll be right back. Get better. So I want to talk about something that I talked about last week that I was not able, obviously the episode wasn't salvaged, so hopefully we can talk about that now. So I want to talk about the minimum wage and why a bad law or a bad fix is worse than no law or no fix. So hopefully people can hear me now. So obviously the minimum wage has been in the news a lot. There's been some discussion that the minimum wage could be raised to $15 an hour pegged to inflation by 2026. Obviously there's issues there because in 2026, $15 will not be worth what $15 then will not be worth what $15 is today. Additionally, the problem becomes once it is fixed as a problem or brought up to whatever wage people think is appropriate, we're going to have the problem of it becomes very difficult to deal with that issue again. Let me just get a sip here and then I'll talk a little more about that. So what happens, so the reason the minimum wage is important to this conversation is because when we talk about fixing things that hopefully shouldn't have to be fixed in the future, the minimum wage is a really good example because the minimum wage effectively gets lower every year, right? Because of the way that prices go up every year. I'm sure you've heard of the Consumer Price Index. If not, it's often shortened to CPI. CPI is essentially just a measure of the increase in prices of consumer goods and services every year. So you can actually see, I think it goes up a few percent every year, but you can see essentially in real time, well, not in real time, but once a year, you can pretty much get a report from the federal government as how much weaker your dollar is against the types of things you have to buy. So it doesn't have specific items on there, but it might list like a set of services or a utility or something like that, where it gets the amount of money that it takes to acquire that service or that good increases because the price goes up, which means that your wage goes down every year because the real value of that wage, it buys fewer things, right? So if we're going to fix the minimum wage, we have to pay it to inflation to make sure that every year workers get a raise, to make sure that the value of that wage, whatever it is, continues to be worth that amount the next year, right? Or else we just have this problem where the minimum wage kind of constantly needs to be fixed, and there always needs to be political will to do it. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a second too. So I'm going to use the minimum wage as an example just because it's in the news, but generally speaking, the conversation I want to have a little bit is about bad laws and bad fixes. So you may have heard of political capital. Political capital is essentially the amount of leeway that you have with the public to do the things that you want to do, the amount of support you have from the public, and the amount of pressure that other lawmakers feel to cooperate with you when you're first elected or when you're trying to do anything, right? So a great example of this was AOC. When AOC was elected, she had a great amount of political capital. She had lots of support, lots of eyeballs on her, and people were very willing to contact their congresspeople to make noise about the types of things that she was interested in passing. She had political capital, and although she was not able to pass anything particularly with it that was on her priority list, she did get, for example, the resolution about the Green New Deal passed to get that conversation going, and now the Green New Deal is a part of American discourse. So she didn't use that political capital to pass a bill, but she did do it to kind of move the Overton window. Quick aside here, the Overton window is the acceptable range of dialogue in American politics. She was able to move the Overton window a little bit more towards that progressive direction. Another good way to think about political capital is presidents. Typically, when presidents come in, they have a lot of political capital. The other place where political capital is very high, other than elections and re-elections, is if a president is assassinated or something tragic happens to the president's family. Typically, the country will come together around the president. Also, if there's a war, right? If there's an attack or if there's some traumatic event that the nation has experienced together, the president typically has a lot of political capital to respond to it. And there's going to be lots of cooperation from other politicians because there's a feeling that whatever it is urgent and has to be solved now, and that we should follow the president either for patriotic reasons or because the president's popular, and tagging your vote to the president's vote is going to help you as well. So that's generally what political capital is. So now that I've explained a little bit what political capital is, I want to talk about political capital pushed in the direction of fixing things, right? So to go back to the discussion before, politicians have very limited political capital at any given time. Obviously, they get huge surges of political capital at certain points, which I just mentioned. But for the most part, they don't have a ton of political capital. Americans are very distracted. There are lots of issues that people are concerned about. People are issue-oriented in different ways, and things like that. So it is important that a politician uses their political capital to achieve an end that is not going to require a fix, because if they do, when the time comes to fix it, the likelihood is the political capital will not be there to fix the problem. Which brings us back to the minimum wage. And plenty of other issues too, but I do just want to focus on the minimum wage particularly for this. So the minimum wage, if it isn't placed, let me step back for a second. So what needs to happen with the minimum wage, obviously, is that it needs to become a living wage. Whatever that number we decide it is, whether it's 15 or 25 or 30 or whatever, personally, I think it's probably up on the higher end, near 25, especially now. But whatever that number is, it has to be a living wage. And just to remind you, a living wage is a wage that is made by an individual that allows them to afford their basic necessities. This includes a place to stay, so a month's rent, your utilities, weekly groceries, and anything else that might be essential for your existence as a worker. By the way, this might mean if you're in the suburbs, having a car, or if there's lots of public transportation by you, bus or train tickets, right? So these 4 or 5 things are the essentials. They're the very basics. With nothing else considered, your wage, if you work 40 hours a week, should cover all of that, right? So if you do the math on that, you run some averages. In 2012, that's what they did, and they figured out that $15 an hour would have been a great minimum wage for 2012. That's when the fight for 15 started. We're now in 2021, it's been 9 years, and each year the value of $15 has decreased. As I mentioned earlier, money inflates each year, so money deflates each year as the prices of goods and services increase each year. However small that might be, it is constant. And if you look at it over the last decade, which is more or less what's passed since the fight for 15 started, you get to a place where you realize that $15 today is not worth nearly as much as $15 in 2012 is worth a different amount than $15 is now. So the point is, with the minimum wage, is that when it finally becomes implemented, it needs to still be a living wage, which is the point I'm trying to get to. So if we're going to have a plan that takes us to 2026, a 5-year plan to implement the minimum wage, whatever the number we pick today is, or when the bill is passed is, needs to be enough or pegged to dollars from today, has to be enough so that it's still a living wage when we get out the other end, right? So if we say it's $25, just for example, and it'll be implemented in 2026, we need to make sure that in 2026, when the $25 minimum wage law is implemented, that $25 an hour still allows people to have a living wage. Or sorry, it's still a living wage for people who are going to be making it at that point, especially because many corporations use the minimum wage as also a maximum wage, and they say, well, we're legally required to pay you this and we're not going to pay you any more than that. So hopefully this is, hopefully our politicians are thinking about this. They're probably not, but I want you to think about this when you're thinking about the minimum wage conversation going forward. Which brings us back to the original point of this segment, which is why a bad law is worse than no law at all. So for the minimum wage, which is an issue which constantly requires political capital, hopefully I've established that for you. If a bad minimum wage is passed now and it goes through, let's say $12 an hour implemented in 2026, which by the way would be dismal and might actually be worth less than the $7.25 an hour is now. But that aside, so say that it's implemented. So 2026 comes around, it's worth we get $12 an hour, people are making $12 an hour. If $12 an hour in 2026 is a poverty wage, it is going to be almost impossible to raise it. And the reason is because if they do a fix now, the fix is going to be tied to inflation. And the argument from politicians will be, and it'll be very easy for them to make this, well, why do we have to fix this issue again? We just fixed it 5 years ago, and it's pegged to inflation, so you get a raise every year. But if the raise you're getting every year is still a poverty wage, then it doesn't matter that you're getting a raise every year. That raise is not providing you with enough money to afford your basics. It is effectively not a living wage. So if there is no solution to the minimum wage fight, people do still suffer. That's true, and I'm not discounting that. But if we pass a minimum wage law now that is pegged to inflation, that doesn't consider what a living wage is or isn't actually a living wage, the problem that we're really going to have is that people will have poverty wages, albeit a tiny bit higher, forever. Because unless there is a real issue, the political will and the political capital will not be there to fix it again. And of course, with the added problem that politicians will say, well, it's pegged to inflation, so you get a raise anyway, every year. This, of course, is not the only issue where this is the case. We can look at things like healthcare, right? So in 2008, the Patient Prevention and Affordable Care Act was passed, also known as the ACA, also known as Obamacare. And it wasn't particularly a great system. Yes, it introduced some fixes to the system, which I have both taken advantage of, like being on my parents' health care plan until I was 26, and also being able to get free free checkups, what are they called, physicals, so I don't have to pay any copays for that. But the thing is, it wasn't Medicare for all, right? It wasn't a nationalized health care service where no matter what, you could get health care for free, and there wasn't all this bureaucracy involved, and there was only one, and there was a single payer and things like that. So because that is the case, there is going to be less political will now to pass a new healthcare law, because the idea is, well, we passed the Affordable Care Act and it did improve some. Whether you think it's enough or not, and again, just to reiterate, I don't believe it was enough. But the idea, the response from politicians will be, well, it did make some fixes and it was very hard to pass. It shouldn't have been, but it was. So therefore, we should not have, it's going to be very difficult for us to pass a new thing. Therefore, there's not going to be a solution. So regardless of what your issue is, whether it's a Green New Deal that isn't sufficient, an infrastructure plan that isn't sufficient, any of those other things, it's important to remember that it might be better for the society as a whole to actually not have the fix right now until we can get the best fix. Now, there are some things we're running out of time, right? So Green New Deal, obviously anything related to climate change where there's actually a clock going, then it might make sense to accept a bad deal. But for the most part, we need to remember that a bad fix is going to be worse than no fix at all. And hopefully the reasons I just outlined help you understand why that is. All right, we have about 10 minutes left. Let's check on this. All right, we are rising. We're not doubled in size yet, so I'm going to keep this going. And I think I'm actually going to add, 30 minutes to our timer. We did have muting for a while, and on the playback, this will be cut short about that long. So let's do that real quick, and then let's get into some new topics. Again, I'm really sorry about muting myself earlier. I really did have some good things to say about the vaccine, and maybe by next week we just don't even have this on the whiteboard. But and I had some good things to say about the Iraq War, the Afghan War, and the deep state as well. So we will do the segments another day. Again, I am really sorry that didn't work out, but hopefully we can talk about some more stuff together while we're waiting for our bread to rise. So I want to move on to some labor stuff. Hopefully this will be really relevant still because of the fallout from Bessemer, Alabama. And that's what I want to touch on first. So what happened in Bessemer? So as all of you probably know by now, the Bessemer, Alabama unionization effort failed. The Amazon had enough votes in its favor to crush the union vote. There's a lot of news about this. I will touch on some of it briefly, but for the most part, just know that the result of this as of right now is that the union was not successful in holding their vote in Alabama, which is very unfortunate for the labor movement, but not ultimately a loss, a large-scale loss. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things that Amazon did and does, which may have hurt the union effort. You may have seen reports that Amazon requires their employees to have to sit through these video trainings, these kind of anti-union video trainings. Jeff Bezos, who's the CEO of Amazon, was at a tech conference or was being interviewed for something, and he said that he believes that they have a good relationship with their workers and that they do not need a union. That's bullshit, but that's okay. Amazon worked with the local Bessemer officials to change the speed of the traffic lights so that the union organizers couldn't talk to people while they were waiting for the light about the union. There was some concern on Amazon's part that union organizers were using that time people were waiting at the light to get out of the factory parking lot to talk to people about the union. And it's true, that is in fact what was happening, but they couldn't organize on the Amazon
warehouse property. So this was kind of the compromise, right? This is what they were able to do the organizing, and then Amazon undermined that as well. Additionally, Amazon worked with the Postal Service and pressured the Postal Service to install a drop box for its union card ballots on Amazon property, which gave the illusion that Amazon was able to kind of see what people were doing and monitor that. So there's a lot of intimidation factors there. There was a lot of kind of underhanded things from Amazon. And all this has come through leaks, right? So Amazon has been very close-fisted about this. They have tried as much as possible not to reveal their union busting tactics, but these have all come forward. Ken Klippenstein of The Nation has done a lot of good work on this. You should check out his work as well. But you can pretty much find this information more or less anywhere now about Amazon's efforts to fight the union. So where that all brings us to the result, which I mentioned earlier. So what now? So there's a couple of things. So the first thing I want to point out is, A, this is not a general loss for the union movement. It is very upsetting, but this particular battle actually is not over yet. So the reason is, according to labor lawyers that I've spoken to, and as well as the union itself, the union is in plans to bring forth its case to the NLRB, which is the National Labor Relations Board, who oversees the union vote process, alleging that there was fraud on behalf of Amazon, and then they conduct themselves in an illegal manner. They are very confident at this point that the NLRB will allow for a revote. So we actually may get another bite of this apple, which would be very exciting. Hopefully, after seeing all of the fight that Amazon put up against the union, that workers will believe that actually the union is in their best interest. I do want to point out real quick that Amazon pays its workers $15 an hour as a minimum starting salary, a starting wage. You can thank Bernie Sanders and Ro Khanna for that, but for the most part, not for the most part, sorry, you can thank Bernie Sanders and Ro Khanna for that. Amazon does pay a decent wage, which is much higher than the surrounding wage in Bessemer. So there was some concern that Amazon was framing the union fight that if you voted for the union, you would actually lose your $15 an hour because the union would fight for a lower wage. I don't really understand what the messaging there was, but there was some thought that there was some fear about it due to how much more people were making at the warehouse than they would have made at those jobs. Okay, so where are we now? So obviously, the union and Amazon are both kind of fighting as much as possible to have the vote kind of definitively called in their direction. And by the union wanting it called in their direction, what I mean is not that the union would be formed, which obviously would be ideal, but that there'd be a revote. I think the move right now is for there to be a revote. Hopefully, if there is a revote, it will be a stronger showing from the union. I believe it was 66% against and 33% for. I think they just need 51. So 33 is not bad, and especially if you get a second try so quickly, hopefully that other 18% will come fairly easily, or at least we'll have seen the types of things that Amazon did to intimidate them, and we'll fight for the union. But it's hard to say about that particular warehouse. What's interesting actually now is that this fight, because it made such big news and there was so much information about it, is that according to the union, who the Amazon workers were trying to unionize underneath, they have been reporting that other warehouses in other states have been reaching out to them and asking for ways to help them organize. So even if there is a loss here, if Bessemer can't get organized into a union for some reason and the NLRB does not allow for a revote, this may actually not be the last time this particular fight takes place, or even this fight generally speaking, because it looks like more Amazon warehouses are going to try to organize. So I think in the long run, it's important to think about the Bessemer fight as being very important for labor in general. Obviously, it could have been a gut punch or the spark that starts the fire, or whatever metaphor you want to use to really kickstart the labor movement. back into some strength. But it's hard to say, right, if that actually would have been the case. But it does look like it has started, it has lit the fire under some other people in some other warehouses who are trying to unionize. So it does look like organized labor is making a tiny bit of a comeback, which is really what labor needs, as the amount of people in unions, I think it's like 6% of all private sector workers are unionized. So it's very, very low. Labor needs victories where they can get it. And this was definitely not the victory that it needed, of course, because it wasn't a victory at all. But if there is a victory here, if they are able to fight Amazon and they are able to get a revote and they are able to get that 51% for the union, it's going to be really important for labor in general. It's going to make waves, and hopefully it will set off, not just in Amazon warehouses, but in other workplaces as well, kind of a push to unionize, which is really what we need in order to, A, mobilize against our politicians who are not doing what we need them to do, but also to change the landscape of what working looks like in America. Shortened work week, shorter work days, better wages, better benefits, things like that. So hopefully we can have some of that. But I did just want to fill you in a little bit on what was going on in Bessemer, Alabama, and hopefully, and as we have more news here, more labor news, we'll definitely follow it. And if there's anything to report back on or any celebration to do, hopefully we can do that together, as I would really like for there to be a union at that warehouse, and of course in all workplaces. Sorry, guys. So, speaking of the benefits that a union can give you, I want to talk about the exploitative nature of the 8-hour workday. So, if you work for a salary like I do, or even work an average wage job, you work 8 hours a day, right? So originally, when the 8-hour workday was being negotiated, back when people were working in factories for 12, 16 hours a day at a time, and were doing this backbreaking labor, the idea of having an 8-hour workday was to divide your day into thirds, right? 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for relaxation, and 8 hours for work. This is what seemed fair at the time. Now, even back then, there were some things that made that a little less fair. For example, jobs were being automated, especially in clothing factories and textiles and things where machines were doing a lot of the work. But the idea was you'd only work 8 hours, and that was going to be enough for the capitalist class that we were making all the wealth for. Over time, as things have become more automated and productivity has increased, 8 hours has become increasingly exploitative. And the reason this is true is partially because we no longer live very close to our places of work, right? We don't all live in the city, and these big factories are, within walking distance or what have you, or you live in a factory town, or you live next to the mine, or you live on the farm, whatever it is, right? We don't live particularly close to our workspaces, so there's commute times, lunches are not paid for, right? So let's break down what a day looks like and how much it's actually eating out of your other time. And I'll remind you that work, that 8 hours of work, the way you should think about it is it should be considered the 8 hours that you dedicate to your employer. Not necessarily that you're getting anything done, not necessarily that you're getting things done for every second of the 8 hours, and most studies shows that employees don't do that, but we should think about it as this is the amount of time that you dedicate to your employer, okay? So let's think about the things that you dedicate that are dedicated more or less to your employer, right? Your commute to and from work. This is not really time you have to yourself. It's not time that can be really thought well about being in your relaxation time because of the way that you can't do some of the other things that you would do if you're commuting. Now, if you're not driving, if you're taking the train or something, maybe you have some moments where you can do something that's a little bit more relaxing, but it's not really relaxation time. It is time that you're dedicating to your employer. It's time you're taking out of your day to get to your job so that you can do your work. The other one is a lunch break. Most lunch breaks are not paid. So it seems like it should be a relaxation time, but it's placed right in the middle of your workday. And oftentimes it's very difficult to escape the workplace to actually have that time to yourself. Now, it may be a little different with people maybe find it from work from home, but a lot of the times the issue becomes that if you're in an office or if you're in a job where you can't leave or whatever, your work time, your lunch time as either quasi work time or you feel that it's still dedicated to your employer because you can't go off and do something relaxation, right? So for the sake of argument, let's say that you have an hour commute each direction and you have an hour lunch that is unpaid. So at this point, all that time is dedicated to your employer as well as your 8-hour workday. So we're now looking at 11 hours, which is not great. So when you finally do get home, you have 5 hours of relaxation before you're supposed to get your 8 hours of rest, sleep. So, but, oftentimes because either you live alone or you and your partner both work, the things that need to be done at home oftentimes take up a lot of the other relaxation time, which doesn't make it relaxation time, it just makes it a different kind of work, right? Which your employer is not necessarily responsible for, but it should be a consideration. You consider what is fair for the modern worker to be doing, especially in light of the amount of productivity and capital that we are creating for the capitalist class. So when you get home, you may have to do laundry, you may have to do, especially if you wear a uniform to work and have to wash it every day, you may have to make dinner. So the point is that even when you're at home, oftentimes your leisure is removed from you because of the amount of other things you have to do. And in theory, we have the weekend for that, but oftentimes types of errands and things that you want to run on the weekends, not everywhere is open, right? There's lots of reasons why the weekend isn't necessarily enough time for you to do all the things you need to maintain your home when you don't have time during the work week. So the question is, do we still need an 8-hour workday? Is that still fair? So the answer is no. And the reason is because, one, due to automation and due to the assistance of machines, the average worker is making more capital than their ancestors were doing for the same job. Their forefathers and mothers were doing for the same jobs. Machines have, including computers, have made us incredibly productive members of our workspaces, and not only have wages not increased for that, but also we're still working these long hours. And by the way, 8 hours is what you're supposed to work. Many people find that they're working longer than that, but instead of 40-hour weeks, they're working 50-hour weeks or 60-hour weeks. Some people work 80-hour weeks, and all of this takes away from the time you're supposed to have as a worker to rest, right? The original deal, which was 8 hours of rest, 8 hours of relaxation, and 8 hours of work. So the solution here is one of two things. One, you can reduce the workday, each individual workday to any number of hours shorter than it is now, or you can reduce the number of days that people work. Recently, and I covered it on last week's show, which obviously doesn't exist, but one of the largest unions over there negotiated a 4-day work week with cycling schedules such that there wasn't like an extra day where the factory wasn't going. And this is great because it allows workers to do their errands and other things on a day that's technically a weekday, but doesn't require them to be working. And this is great for labor because it allows you to do other things or just have extra day of relaxation. And especially because we're making so much profit, we're creating so much capital, which in turn becomes so much profit for the capitalist class, we deserve this, right? We don't need to have to work terrible hours and to hate everything about our position in order for us to earn the right to have more leisure time. The promise of capitalism is that we would work smarter, we would work less, and that we'd be happier and we'd be healthier. But the truth is, the 8-hour workday forces us to take conveniences that we wouldn't ordinarily need, right? Delivery services for food, delivery services for laundry, any little convenience that we can get. And the reason that we buy all these conveniences is because we always feel like we don't have enough time in our days. If we had more time in our days to do the types of things that we would want to do, that we didn't need the convenience for, we wouldn't always spend so much money. The reason the 8-hour workday is so exploitative is not just because we're creating more capital than ever for the capitalist class who is not giving that back to us. It's not just because we don't have enough, because we're dedicating more than 8 hours of our day to the capitalist class. It's not just for those reasons. It's because of the importance to the capitalist class of having workers that feel constantly exhausted and that they need to cut corners for every little thing. And the way that as workers we cut corners is we spend our hard-earned money on little conveniences. And those little conveniences, like the gig economy, for example, make the capitalist class lots and lots of money. So we are forced more or less into these spending sprees for things that we don't want, that we don't necessarily need, in order for the capitalist class to continue to exploit us, because we are exploited on both ends. We're exploited at work because we dedicate more time than we should to our workplaces, and we're exploited at home because we have so little time left and so little energy left when we come home that any little convenience that we can spend money on is going, in theory, makes us feel better about ourselves and makes us feel like we have more time, even though we don't. And all of these functions allow the capitalist class to get very rich off of us. So the solution to this, of course, is to reduce the amount of hours that the average worker works. But in order to do that, we need organized labor, which hopefully we get more of soon with the Bessemer story. So we're gonna stay on our labor kick a little bit, and I want to talk about why union. Why do we need unions? So traditionally speaking, the reason that a union was necessary was to get higher wages and safer working conditions. And unions have typically been thought about a lot of times in the sphere of blue collarism. So you work on a shop floor, you work on a factory floor, you do what is sometimes unfairly referred to as unskilled labor. By the way, a quick aside here, none of that labor is unskilled. All labor is skilled. If it wasn't skilled, then the capitalist class wouldn't need us, but they do. So unskilled labor is just a lie that is told by the capitalist class to make workers fight each other and to decrease our wages. That aside. So typically, why we need unions has always been thought about in this blue collar context, which is, oh, you know, the factory shop needs to be better, the people who work kind of these repetitive positions need to have better working conditions and things like that. But that idea is incomplete. White collar workers also need unions, and the reason that white collar workers need, not the reason that all workers need unions, including white collar workers, is because there will always be some facets of your work life that you share with your fellow employees. For white collar workers, instead of wages and job safety, although sometimes it is job safety, it typically is like a healthcare plan, an insurance plan, a death benefit, number of hours a week you have to work, what systems are used, decisions about the company that are made, investiture in the company itself, right? Things that white collar workers typically don't think about because they receive a salary, and oftentimes that salary is higher than a wage, but not always. But these are ways that a union can help white collar workers as well. So it's important that we think about unions outside the traditional dichotomies of blue collar workers need a union, white collar workers do not need a union, because the truth is, at the very base level, you will share something with all of your fellow employees, even if you don't work the same general positions as them, even if you don't make the same wage or salary as them, even if you don't work in the same office spaces as them. It's important that you have a union because the power of organized labor allows you to force your employer to improve whatever facets of your work life are being used against you or are insufficient for the types of work-life balance that is appropriate for workers. So if you're interested in forming a union, there are lots of resources out there. I'm not the best resource for that, which is why I'm directing you somewhere else. But don't think about yourself as not being qualified to have union representation because you're a white-collar worker or anything like that. The only workers that do not need a union are those workers in the capitalist class, the ones who own the means of production. Otherwise, there is always a way that your workplace can be more representative of the workers, can be more representative of their needs, can adapt to their needs better, and can serve the workers more. It will always, if you don't have a labor union, if the capitalists of your company, if the owners of your company make split decisions, you don't have any influence there. You can't stop them. Each of us fighting alone is unable to take on the corporate machine because the entirety of the resources of the corporation are turned against you, and they hold your employment at the drop of a hat. It's most of us, almost all of us, work at-will employment. If we speak up, we can be fired, and although there are rules to protect us, they often aren't enforced. The only way to protect your rights as a worker is to have a union, whether you're a white-collar worker or blue-collar worker. So don't think about unions in the sense of you need to be a certain type of worker to have them. Every worker can benefit from a union, and that is why have a union. So there are, I've got about 15 minutes left. Let's just check the bread real quick. All right, this is almost done. So I actually may, let's see where this is at in 10 minutes. In the meanwhile, I want to talk a little bit about the housing crisis. So, by the way, this is an international issue. Many people know about the housing crises that are occurring in America, specifically in places like California and New York. But the type of housing crisis that I'm going to talk about is actually endemic, more or less, to the entire world. So I want to start with what the housing crisis is. So the housing crisis is twofold. One is that rents are very high and people can't afford them. And so people are becoming houseless or unhoused. So actually, I'm going to pause right here and make a little bit of a distinction. To me personally, and I've talked to people who disagree, but personally, I believe that there's a significant difference between houseless and unhoused and homeless, okay? So the reason I say this, so to me, unhoused or houseless means that you don't have a roof over your head, or you don't have a place that you can call your own. You don't have somewhere to go at the end of the day. And that doesn't include shelters, but I mean a place that you actually, spend time in, that you can customize, that you can do things to, right? So I rent a house, but obviously I put things up on the walls that I can take down, right? This is a house. It's not necessarily a home. I don't own it, okay? So that brings me to what I think homelessness is. So homelessness, in my opinion, is the inability for someone to have a place that they want to make their permanent living situation, or that they own, right? So you can rent a place and have it be your permanent place of residence. That's fine. I think that would be a home. But where you just have a roof over your head, even if you like that roof over your head, and look, I love living in this house, but it doesn't change the fact that I don't own this house and we're not planning to live here forever, right? If you have a place that you're comfortable living forever, or you have a place that you can own, that is what I think as having a home. Right now, I'd say I have a house. I have a roof over my head. It's a nice roof, but it is more or less just a roof over my head. And I call it home to other people in the colloquial sense that I feel at home here, but there is a transigence about this house in my mind. I will not live here forever, right? Once you get to a place where you feel that is no longer transactional, that's no longer an in-between, that I think is a home. So those kind of definitions, if you will, aside, let's get back to the issue here. So the first issue, as I mentioned, is rents are too high and lots of people are houseless or unhoused. And the second issue is there is reduced stock of houses to purchase. So people who can afford houses aren't necessarily able to get them because either they're being purchased by other people or because they're being purchased and renovated for the purpose of renting them, again, at rents that are too high and causing unhoused people. And by the way, this also causes people who could afford homes, who could build generational wealth, who could build wealth into a place where they are instead building wealth for the capitalist class who is able to collect rents, right, and not particularly do anything for those, or collect rents at a high enough profit that they can sit tidy and not have to do work, labor work, like you and I do. So the origin of these problems around the world are pretty much the same thing. So very wealthy people have found that it is very easy to purchase houses in cash, and people don't ask a lot of questions about where the cash comes from. It's just, you know. So what happens is very wealthy individuals and developers, they buy either one house, they buy multiple houses, or they build tons of houses, and they then sell those houses, they speculate on those houses to other developers who will then rent those houses out. And there's a lot of money to be made that way, but also it launders money. It cleans the money. So when the money is then sold, if it's then sold again, you know, that money that comes back to them, more or less clean money, right? So what's happening in a lot of places is that, so for example, very wealthy people will buy up huge amounts of houses or homes that they never intend to live in. So this was a huge problem in London a bunch of years ago. I think it's still a problem where Saudi royalty were buying you know, a dozen condos and the penthouse of multiple very expensive high-rises, but they buy them for much more than they were worth. So what this was doing was it was causing the housing prices around them to increase because of the perception of the heightened demand, and also because there were fewer condos to sell, which lowered the supply with either demand increasing artificially or staying the same naturally. The price was going to go up. So this isn't just happening in London. Of course, it's happening in all sorts of places around the world. New York City is actually a great place. It's a great American example of where this is happening, where very wealthy people from abroad are buying expensive condos for more than they're worth, and then using and then not living in them. Right? They stay vacant. Either they get rented out or they stay vacant. Most of the time, they're staying vacant. So we have all these. Houses that are not being used by people who need them, but are also essentially just serving as little money pits for very wealthy people who can then salvage their money later by selling them to someone else. But what it does is, as the supply decreases, as the demand stays the same or increases artificially, what ends up happening is that regular people are priced out of these homes. So they're having to move farther and farther away from where they want to live, or they have to live in places that they don't want to live necessarily because they can't find an affordable home where they do want to live. And this kind of cycle has created this incredible situation where we have about 6 houses. This is just the United States, by the way. I don't know how this is in other countries, but we have about 6 houses per unhoused individual in America. So obviously there are solutions out there to this. One is to create vacancy taxes. One is to require people to live in places for a certain amount of time per year that they own, and things like, or else the state can take them. There's eminent domain, which is the legal operation by which a city, state, locality, whatever, seizes property for its market, seizes property, pays the owner its market value, and then redistributes it as it sees fit. But the thing is, there has to be something done because we are increasingly in a place where we have more and more unhoused individuals and more of these luxury homes or luxury condos that cannot be sold or rented to people because the rent is too high, or the price of the house is too high, or even when the price of the house is acceptable, individuals who think they can make a profit off of these houses by renting them can buy them up in cash, right? So, and of course, this creates an interesting market dynamic as well because if you, right, because the market will always move towards more liquid currency. So what I mean when I say liquid currency is if a currency is considered liquid when it is easily movable, right? So it's or can be used immediately. It has what's called never mind. So anyway, so the easier that money is to move, the more liquid it is, right? So if you have an asset, say this island is an asset that's worth, let's just say $200. I don't know what it costs, but let's just say it's worth $200, right? This is a non-liquid asset. I have to sell this to someone to get cash so that I can do other things with it. No one's going to trade me this for my grocery bill, right? I need cash to do that because that's the medium of exchange. So because the market will always favor more liquid cash, if you're paying a down payment on a mortgage, which is, of course, a loan that comes in that you pay back over a period of time, it is going to be easier for someone to receive cash for an asset than it is to wait for the bank to give you the mortgage and to figure out all the rates and sign all the paperwork. So the market will always tend in that direction. And because the market trends in that direction, anyone who is wealthy enough to buy in cash is always going to outperform people who cannot buy in cash. So even where houses can be purchased by individuals with mortgages, if the house is desirable for renting, which, you know, depending on a variety of factors, if a house is useful for renting, then a developer can come in and pay cash for it, and even if they're offering less than you, they will beat you out as a regular individual who's buying a home because you have to use a mortgage, which is more complicated than just someone handing a briefcase of cash to the other person. So hopefully we can move some policy around to do this, but this is an international problem. This is a money laundering problem, and we need some way to tax these individuals and tax corporations to make sure that there is not a situation like in the United States where we have 6 houses for every one unhoused person. Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about for this week. Let's look at our bread. Oh, we are doing, wow, this bread is gorgeous. So take a look. We have risen at least twice. Wonderful. I'm going to put this right here. And we're going to bring forth, turn time off. We're going to, so I have a loaf tin here. I'm also going to put some bread on our other tray there. But for now, I hope you saved your butter wrapper. We are going to oil this down real quick. Use the residual butter on the sheet to create a little butter line. Make sure to get all the corners. All right, so this is nice and greasy. It's kind of hard to see, but I promise you it is. All right, so now we're going to wash our hands because we've been touching a lot of things. And then we are going to take this out, divide it in half, and shape our bread. So I'll be right back. Okay, so our hands are washed. Splash myself a little bit, but it's okay. So our hands are washed, so now what we're gonna do, get rid of the whiteboard real quick. All right, I'm back. You can see me hopefully. All right. All right, so now we're gonna take our bread and pour it out onto our surface. Look at that. That is a beautiful loaf. So what we're gonna do is we're just gonna knead this into a ball real quick. I know I'm pushing a lot of the air out of it, but that's okay. So we're now going to use this and mix some of this flour away. We don't need this much flour. By the way, don't waste your flour. You can't put it back in you cannot put it back in the bags, but you can put it in little baggies, which you should do. All right, so now we have a nice little round of dough. And by the way, just I show you every week, I'm using my hands in a cupping motion like this and rotating. So I have a nice ball here. Let's get some of the extra flour off. All right, so now what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna divide this dough right in half. I'm not weighing it, I'm doing this by eye. If you want to weigh it, feel free to, but I don't need to. So we're gonna have our 2 halves. So the first half is gonna be really easy. So we're just gonna put it in this bread tin. So I'm going to shape it into a log. And I'm not using any particular method for this. Again, I'm just using, my hands are thoroughly floured at this point, so I'm just using my hands here to create a little log. And then I'm just gonna put this log right in our loaf tin. It looks a little small in there, it will grow, don't worry about it. Now the second one's gonna be a little harder. So I'm actually gonna take some flour here, some spare flour here, and we're gonna push this out into a large circle. So using your knuckles, push this out into a circle. Because we're gonna make what's called a batard with this. So use your hands. We just want this to be a large circle and pretty flat, because we're gonna be rolling this up to help it keep its shape. So just move this around. All right, flip it over. All right, so it's not perfectly round. That's fine, not really the end of the world. It will do the job. Stretch it out a little bit if you can. If not, no worries. Okay, so now what we're going to do, now we have our bread in more or less a circle, rectangle thingy. All right, so it's way more of a rectangle than a circle. That's okay. Let's try and make it a circle. All right, so we're going to take one end, fold it over. Okay, I'm going to take the second end and fold it over. And then we're going to take this end here and we're going to roll it up nice and tight, like a burrito. Okay, so this will rise now. So these two are going to rise. We're going to put this on our tray, and this is actually going to stay in this shape. Okay. Let's bring our tray over. All right. So this is going to rise on our tray, and it should rise up instead of out because it's rolled pretty tightly. If you're concerned about it, re-roll it. Do not try and roll it once it's risen. Okay. Don't do that. It's not going to work. It's not going to work out. So the last thing we're going to do this episode is we're going to cover these up and let them rest. So I'm going to get some plastic wrap to put these over, and I'm going to put our towel over them. So we're going to let these rest for an hour or until they double in size. So what that means, of course, is you're gonna let them. So imagining about twice the size they're going to be, you want to make sure that they are about that size when you get them. I will say though, just be careful to not let it proof too much, If it doesn't, if it's not as big as you want it to be, but it has doubled in size anyway, that's fine, just leave it. It will rise additionally in the oven, remember, when we kill off the yeast. But for now, this rising is being done by the yeast. And the reason we're covering it in plastic, by the way, is to keep the moisture in. Because if it dries out, it's not going to rise. All right? So I'm going to put our towel over here, over our 2 loaves of bread. We're going to set a timer for an hour. And that is what we're going to call it. So what's going to happen now? Is here's what you're going to do, okay? We're going to let these sit for 1 hour. And once we do that, they're going to be ready to cook. So we're going to set our ovens to 350 degrees, and we are going to let these cook in the oven for about 25 to 30 minutes on the middle rack until light brown. If you cook them both at the same time, about halfway through you want to switch their positions just to make sure that they're getting even heat on both sides. If you want a cragglier crust, if you want a harder crust, make sure you paint your bread with water beforehand. If you want a little bit of a softer crust, you can paint it with milk. And if you want a nice brown crust, like we usually get in our challah recipe, you can take an egg and put it on top. I am going to, because this is supposed to be a fluffy recipe, I am going to use milk. I'm going to paint our bread with milk, and then in a few hours I will upload the picture. Once again, I am sorry about the long period of time where I was talking at you on mute. I will fix that, and I'll go through and do more topics next week. Thank you so much for your patience. I really appreciate it. I will see you next week, and we'll bake bread together. Take care, everyone.